Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast, and I am Nate McLennan. Today, we are focused on unbundled learning, the third in a three-part series where we talk to folks in different states, Colorado first, and then Arizona second, and today we're in our last installment with New Hampshire. And we're really thinking about how students can learn outside of the normal constraints of a classroom or a typical school, and what are the different policies and schools that have started to work and make these things become a reality. So the last podcast, I talked about grain size and unbundling, the unbundling at the curriculum level or the course level or the school level, and then really in this ecosystem level. How do people to learn outside in different organizations and then restack that into a learning experience? And I know that's happening in New Hampshire. And so today I just want to present a different context for this around a matrix of, if we imagine if left to right, bundled to unbundled, and bottom to top, we have in-system to out-of-system. On the bottom left, most schools and most learning organizations are the structured type of learning experience. So it's bundled and in system. So the learning experiences are all coordinated and designed by the school, and they happen in the school. And then if you go over to the right on that, where it's still in system, but it's unbundled, we talk more about personalized. And there's more and more conversations around personalized learning in the United States. And it's more unbundled because there's more choices, but it's still within the constraints of the system. And then the upper left is happening more and more with ecosystem level work, where you have multiple providers outside of school that are options for students, but they're still bundled. So think CTE courses and internships and apprenticeships that are formally established by the school. And then in the upper right, where you have unbundled ecosystems and out of system, is really what we're going to be talking about today, is this network marketplace, where imagine you have a learning ecosystem where students can pick and choose from all the things they're interested in, and those stack and count for credit in various ways. And so we'll see different examples of that in our conversation. So what's the goal? To ensure that every learner meets the expected or required outcomes, depending on if they're public or non-public sectors, in a manner where they're challenged with relevant experiences and feel like they belong. So that's the end goal, and so that they can reach their full potential professionally, civically, personally. So since the early 2000s, and maybe even earlier, New Hampshire has led the way in building tools and policies and practices that push towards this upper right corner, towards this learning ecosystem. And it's highly personalized and unbundled learning options for all students in New Hampshire. So today, we're joined by Steve Kosakowski, who's the CEO of Virtual Learning Academy Charter School, often called VLACS, for the last 16 years. And then Frank Edelblue, who is the commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Education since 2017. And Frank, I read somewhere that it's one of the longest tenures anywhere in the country for commissioners. So I don't know if that still holds true, but congratulations on that. I hope that's a good thing. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for being on the show.
Happy to be here and joining my colleague, Steve. It sounds like we're going to have a fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And thank you both for your time. So I start off with the same question in most podcasts. And I say it's the Twitter version because some of these stories can go on for a long time. But I love asking our podcast guests, what was your most impactful learning experience during the K-12 years that was outside of school? So something that was outside of school that was impactful for you. And by impactful, I mean you were highly engaged and you learned a lot. So Steve, I'm going to challenge you with this question. What do you remember?
I remember my junior year in high school, my friend Jim and I decided to build a hang glider. We had no money, so we used tree saplings and we used polyethylene, and it was so heavy it didn't work going down a hill, so we pulled it behind a snowmobile, and I almost killed my friend. He didn't get injured, but he went straight up in the air and straight down. But we learned a lot of things trying to put that together and trying to make it work.
Do you have multiple attempts of this, or was one attempt good enough for you to learn that it's not working? How persistent were you?
Yeah, one attempt, because I said it was made out of elastic bands and duct tape and all kinds of things. And he went up about 20 feet or so and then crashed down. It was in shambles by the time it was down there, but it flew. I have pictures.
Frank, it's a hard one to beat, but what do you have for us?
That is a hard one to beat. And actually, I'm going to jump in with two quick ones to keep my time short. But Steve, you shared that one. And I had a similar experience where my brother and I built a boat, a hydroplane. And he went out and drove it out on the water and came back. The outboard motor was on it and it worked fine. And then I hopped in. At the time, I actually had a full light cast on. And I went out from the shore and was speeding along and then was getting ready to turn around. And my brother on the shore is jumping up and down, screaming something, but I couldn't hear a thing that he was saying. And I turned, but I turned the opposite direction he did. He was trying to let me know that the side was falling off and I would quickly sink, which I proceeded to capsize the boat and sink the boat. And so that was good. So that was outside of school and with my brother, and learned a lot there. But mine's kind of an inside outside school. So I had the unique opportunity. I actually attended 4 different high schools in 4 different states. I went to high school in New Jersey, Missouri, Connecticut, and finished up in Pennsylvania. And while those are theoretically inside school, they were outside of each school each year. And so it was oftentimes when people hear that, they're like, oh my gosh, that must have been so difficult. But in fact, I say it was a great experience. I met tons of people. I come from a large family, and I would not have given it up because I got to meet a lot of people in different parts of the country.
Yeah, that is, you think about all the competencies that you had to learn around interacting with, like, recreating friendships, relearning teachers, relearning school. So kudos to that. So hang glider, hydroplane, and 4 high schools in 4 years. I can't top that, but what I'll share today is a little bit like the hang glider and hydroplane. Is we lived near a small creek, and inevitably we would try to build rafts. And I have this very distinct memory, probably it had to be late elementary school, 4th or 5th grade, that we spent a long time building the raft. We put it into the water and we got on it, and it immediately sank to the bottom. And Steve, you were saying is that after that, it stayed submerged. So we didn't try it again. But I do remember it. It's funny what we remember in our brains. We forget a lot of things as we get older, but some things are sticky. I appreciate you both sharing. And I think when we get into the meat of this, what I'm interested in is, let's start with the challenge that you really were trying to solve. So you both come at it from different ways. Steve, you've been a lifer in education. You run a school. Frank, you came into education later in life, but you both were making really interesting things happen. And I'm curious about the challenge you were trying to solve. So maybe Frank, start with you, and then we'll jump to Steve.
Yeah, so that's a big question, but I'm going to start at a certain place. It's a little bit where you started out the blog. I think you described this conversation we're going to have about, can kids learn and can students learn outside of school? And so I would say that my journey starts with a little bit of a different premise. Not can students learn from outside of school? Students are learning outside of school, right? They're learning all the time, especially, once they leave the building quite often. And so I start with kind of this premise that learning is not limited from 7:30 to 2:30 in a specific place. Learning is ongoing and continuous for our students. And so the question for us as educators is really, how do we tap into that? How do we kind of nurture that learning and not try to put learning, as you described? I love the way that you had the quadrants there. Put learning in kind of the bottom left-hand quadrant there and say, this is where learning takes place and other things are happening in other places.
So I love that idea of students, but I always used to say that there's only a small fraction of learning that happens in school that we happen to count, right? That's the thing that shows up in the transcript, the report card, et cetera. But there's no doubt that any human being is learning every second of the day, except maybe while they're sleeping, while they're doing some pruning, but in their brains. But really appreciate that. So Steve, let's jump to you. You've been in the schools for a long time, started VLACS. What was the impetus? How did it work?
Well, I was lucky to work for a very innovative superintendent, and we had started the first charter school that was district-based. And he asked me if I thought that the technology had matured to a point where it could support a virtual school. And I said, yes, it had. And he gave me the time to do the design work to start the school. But I think the premise was based on, at that time, 30 plus years in education, now well into 40. It's something everybody knows, but I think sometimes we don't acknowledge it, is not every student learns the same, and not every student requires the same amount of time to learn. We're all different, but yet our systems are set up to treat every kid in a similar fashion and to expect everyone to arrive at the finish line at the same time. And especially when we look at the changes in the world, learning has got to be ongoing. It's got to happen in many places. And I think to just say it only exists in a school is not where we need to go. And I say this with a great deal of respect for my colleagues who are in traditional schools. They are working very hard, and many times are just bound by kind of the existence of a bureaucracy, the existence of tradition, and so forth. And so it's very difficult to change. But what we really try to do is to allow students to customize their learning based on their needs and their interests and their talents.
One of the ways that I sometimes try to describe it is we basically built a linear learning system in a nonlinear learning model. We know learning sciences indicate that kids learn in very jagged ways. And so the way I like to describe it is Like anybody who's got kids, go to your house, open up the closet, and you're going to see little growth marks on the inside of the closet where you marked up how your kid was growing. Sometimes those growth lines are narrow, and sometimes they have a growth spurt and they're far apart. And so that's how learning happens as well. But when we've got a straight line learning system, it's very difficult for both the educators as well as the students to be engaging that linear model when that's not actually how learning happens.
Yeah, no, that I agree with that. And it does make it easier for everybody if everything is in just one place. The students are all learning the exact same thing at the exact same time. So there's logic behind it that's not really based in learning sciences, but it's based in efficiency. So that's a good pivot, Frank, to maybe jump into a little bit of some of the policy. And I think our listeners, most of them, some of them probably are aware of New Hampshire's work, but I think you have Learn Everywhere, you have extended learning opportunities, you have education freedom accounts. Can you just give a quick summary about those three? How do they interact and how do they expand opportunities for young people?
Yeah. So actually, I'm going to consolidate Learn Everywhere and extended learning opportunities. I'm going to put together because they really are complementary types of a program. So basically, an extended learning opportunity is a program that initiated in school, and we've got it in our rules. And it is to provide an opportunity for the schools to create learning opportunities for students outside of school. And Steve, I think, is going to be able to weigh in on this because he's designed a whole bunch of these extended learning opportunities for students across the state in various communities to try and create those experiences for students, because they're designed around practical, hands-on, experiential learning experiences. Learn Everywhere just went one step further and essentially created extended learning opportunities or Learn Everywhere opportunities at a state level so that a student would be able to take advantage of that opportunity, whether it was coming through the school or even independent of their school, a little bit breaking that wall to move up into that upper right-hand quadrant as you described it. And a unique aspect of that is, whereas a lot of times when these extended learning opportunities are being designed into schools, they're working directly with individual students to figure out what the interest is of the student. How do I move that student forward? Typical education programming, in my experience, has been it's a little bit of a build it and they will come. You get some adult who has a great idea for an education program. They design it and they implement it and they roll it out. And sometimes the kids love it and sometimes they don't. Learn Everywhere is a little different in the sense that essentially what we do is we try and figure out where in the state of New Hampshire kids are congregating, right? Are there a whole bunch of kids at the First Robotics program? Are there kids over at the Boys and Girls Club? Are there students over at the Russian School of Mathematics? And then what we do is we look over their shoulder, we lean in, and we say, hey, are they learning anything there that we care about? And if they are, we try to find a way to be able to award them high school credit for the learning that's taking place in that program that they otherwise would already be participating in. And I just want to add on one aspect of this, because this often comes up as we're talking to potential Learn Everywhere programs, is that oftentimes they say, we just have our program. We're Tokyo Joe. Like we teach kids Taekwondo, right? That's just what we do. And we want to become a Learn Everywhere program. Do we need to do a curriculum? Do we need to do this or do we need to do that? And I'm like, no, whatever you don't do that, right? Don't ruin the magic. Because oftentimes these programs have already found ways to both teach kids, to engage the students. Those kids are there voluntarily because they want to be there, right? And I don't want to ruin that magic. What I want to be able to do is just acknowledge and recognize back in my more structured system, the learning that's taking place in that other environment.
Got it. So Learn Everywhere, more systemic, partner organizations, correct, get authorized to offer credit, et cetera. ELOs at the student level and really customized for that individual student. So Steve, going back to you, what does that look like at VLACS? You take advantage, and presume you take advantage of ELOs, but like, how does that look? What does that give? And some examples for us.
First of all, when we have kids who come to us and we ask them what their interests are and what their needs are and so forth, they can enroll in traditional courses if they want to. And in fact, the vast majority still do. It also goes back to one of the points that was made is why aren't more kids seeking out experiential experiences and situations? But for our kids, we have a program called Experiences. And with Experiences, they can come to us and say, gee, I noticed you already have something set up with a local manufacturer, and I'd like to participate. That's great. But students can also come to us and say, I really have a deep interest in becoming a writer. And I would like to pursue that. And we match them up with a mentor we would look for a professional writer. And they would set about writing articles, a book, or whatever, wherever that journey may take them. It could be someone who's interested in plumbing. It could be someone who's interested in geology. really anything. And it also can take kids down the path of meeting academic requirements, but it can also be career related, art related, whatever really gets them excited and gets them engaged. I think one example, for instance, is recently one of our kids was working with the forensic psychologist for the state of New Hampshire. And once they met and they talked, the idea that the psychologist came up with was, I do a lot of interviews because I have to determine if someone is ready to appear in court. What about if you were to participate in an event, not a real one, but a mock event like that, to really find out what it's like? And then what was interesting is the more that the two talked, he offered to do that on his time and offered to be the person who would be going to court. And the student had to take quite a bit of time to do some studying in between the initial meeting and the second meeting. And then had to do a write-up of the profile and the findings and all those types of things here with a top psychologist in the state of New Hampshire. But it was very real. And if you think about the skills that the student had to or exercise or develop, there's a lot of them there. And I can't help but think that experience will have some impact on the student when they start to think about what they're going to do after high school. And to me, that's a huge win on a number of levels. And we see similar things happen when the student is involved in, maybe they're interested in law or becoming a contractor or in the technology or healthcare profession. It doesn't matter. There's usually something there that engages them and excites them. And there's a lot of deep learning that occurs.
I don't even know if Steve knows this story or not. One of your students, so she was actually in a traditional learning environment, had a lot of social anxiety and was really struggling with that learning environment that she was in. So she, with the advice of her guidance counselor, school counselor, and her teachers, engaged in some VLACS classes and was taking those classes and learning some stuff. And what made me think about this is the writer aspect, Steve. In the course of that, she eventually felt a little bit more comfortable because she went to VLACS and she realized, hey, I can do this. And she was able to overcome some of her social anxiety and then began blending classes in her school as well as classes at VLACS, because Steve is very flexible. He lets kids construct their learning environment how they want. And Steve, I don't know if you know this, but this young lady, so she, again, lots of social anxiety in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. She's blending, she's doing stuff. During her senior year, she wrote a book, which is a published book to this day, about social anxiety in high school. It was published. She graduated from high school, went on to the University of New Hampshire, and we still sometimes hear from her about a great success story of how Steve and his flexibility of his programs, his educators, inspiring. Your teachers inspired her to be a writer, and so she wrote a book. And I think that was her senior project that she had done for you, Steve. And what a great example of a system that is flexible and dynamic to the needs of the students and reacts to the needs of the students to create a pathway where they can have success.
Thank you for sharing that.
I want to tap into, Steve alluded to this, but before we started the pod, we were talking a little bit about just participation. And I think there's a lot of forward-thinking educators, but like both of you and the work we do at Getting Smart, where we're seeing over and over again the power of getting students out doing real-world work or real-world experiences that are relevant and important to them in terms of they just learn more. They're more engaged, they learn more. However, what I want to talk about a little bit is, do you have a sense that this will, in New Hampshire, still always be a small minority of students who are participating in something like this, or whether it's VLACS or taking advantage of ELOs and Learn Everywhere experiences, or is it something that with the right nurturing will continue to grow? And by nurturing, the system, the educators, the school leaders. And so maybe I'll go, Frank, you first, because you, I'm sure, are tracking how people are participating in all these programs. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I appreciate it, although I am excited to hear Steve's answer to the same question as well, because I think it'll be fun for both of us to have an opportunity to weigh in spite of the fact that New Hampshire has been at this for a long time, right? Like we've been at this since 2005, I think at least. Steve might actually tell me that we've been at it for longer than that. I would say that it is still in its nascent form in terms of the engagement and the rollout. And part of that nascency is because it's not that you're just creating these opportunities for these students, but you're bringing families along too. You're bringing educators along as well. And oftentimes when I'm out, if I'm speaking to a group, I say with a degree of hyperbole, I'm asking a question. So how many of you went to school, right? And of course, everybody raises their hand, which means that everybody has a frame of reference when they talk about any kind of an education program, right? Their perspective, good or bad, frames their perception of how it should be. And so when you're asking somebody to, hey, your child can earn their engineering or a coding degree working on a FIRST robotics program, your child can get a theater arts credit by participating in the Boys and Girls Club Theater Arts program, or your child can earn their math credits over at the Russian School of Mathematics. It's very unorthodox for people, right? And so it's hard for families, it's hard for students sometimes, it's hard for educators who are watching this happen outside of their maybe scope of control to even embrace and accept it. And so I'm going to describe it as nascent at this point in time, but I am also going to describe it as inevitable in terms of where it needs to go. All of the right mechanisms are in place for this thing to organically continue to grow and to advance and to create more and more opportunities. And so I'm optimistic that these opportunities are going to continue to expand. And I almost feel like we have to, right? I don't want to go dark on you here, but when I look at and I think about some of our assessment results, look at some NAEP results and stuff like that, we're underserving too many students, right? And maybe we know that because we're looking at that information more closely, but others don't necessarily perceive that or see that. And so we think that and I think in New Hampshire, we believe that there are better ways to reach more children. And so it doesn't have to be an either or. It's not like traditional model versus something else. It's, the right pathway. A way that I describe it, and it's not perfect in this example, but oftentimes people like to talk about, there's a good school and there's a bad school. And I say, that's just a bad framing of the question. It's not good schools and bad schools, because I got good schools where kids are getting wiped out, and I got schools that would be traditionally considered bad schools and kids are thriving. Right. The question is, in a good school, bad school, is it the right school? Is it the right learning environment for that child? And if it's the right learning environment for that child, they're going to succeed. And so we just need to continue to create opportunities for students to find learning environments and have a fluid, just like the example I shared with Steve. Here's somebody who blended some traditional schools, some VLACS, some independent study, puts it all together and was able to overcome those adolescent difficulties and have a successful life going forward.
Yeah. And Steve, I want to jump to you in a second, but it makes me think about the idea that New Hampshire has removed the barriers, right? The doors are open to it. I like the word thinking about inevitable. And it also makes me think just a little bit about the paradigm work that you talked about. I have done these conversations with parents, the same as you, and everybody seems to know what school is, and they have a very clear image of what that looks like. And when you start to say, oh, it can be something different, even if it's good for their children, they still have a hard time overcoming that. And that's the same for educators, school leaders, et cetera. All right, Steve, what's your perspective on this? Are you seeing the growth that you want in terms of looking at VLACS over the last number of years? Or is it just a small group that's going to want this?
I think over the long term, it will grow. But I think there are a number of societal and organizational issues that kind of work against it. One is that I don't think students nor parents understand that they have permission to do this.
Yeah.
And by permission, I don't mean anyone said no, although that does happen. I think learning has to be in a classroom where it's not any good, or it's not rigorous enough, or it's not the right person delivering the information. And also, I think when we look at it from a more macro view, I think there are a lot of innovative educators and classroom teachers who are trying to do things more aligned with this, but they get pushback. You can look at the superintendent level where someone will come in and propose changes that may be a lot more in line with what we're talking about. And perhaps during the first few years, they're very successful and people are happy and excited. And then all of a sudden there's a group within a community that organizes and says, no, that's not how education should look. We need someone else. And next thing, there's a change in leadership, and you get this pendulum effect going back and forth. And it's hard to continue to have continuous improvement if you're always changing what you're doing or you're changing the perspective. And another thing I think is I think that I understand the term unbundling. We really don't use that term. We look at it from, I think, want to get to the same place, but maybe from a different perspective. And we talk about putting the kids in charge of deciding when, where, and how to learn. And will they unbundle education? In some instances, it happens almost immediately where the student says, yes, I want to explore this and I want to do that. And other kids may not be ready. They need real structure and so forth for a while. And I think the key to growing this is to help all students know that it's available and that it's okay to do this. And perhaps that even is something we need to let educators know that it's okay to do this. But it's such a time of rapid change that I think there are a lot of competing issues out there. And then there's the politicization of everything. There's this feeling of you're either on the right side or the wrong side. So it's hard to look at a change like this and say, no, let's all do this together. But I think that's what we need to do. We need to find some common ground and move this forward. But I will say, when kids get involved in this kind of learning, they just get so excited and they're so engaged. I know we've had some part-time students who have done one or two things with us and then come back with stories of, see, I went back to some of the folks at my school and asked if I could do things. And sometimes they have to push a little bit. The kids end up making some change in their school because they ask the adults to look at things a little differently and show how they've been successful, and change starts to occur.
I'm curious, Steve, as your thoughts about, and this is something that I think about, I think some of the barrier to some of this change is the reductionist approach that we have that has siloed education so much, right? Like we have lost a lot of the interconnectedness. Why is it that English language arts and social sciences are bifurcated, and when mathematics is not integrated in the arts and stuff like that? Everybody's working in their little silo. And because of that, it makes it much more difficult to reach across and make the interconnections, which we all know the science to tell us, and we all know from experientially, that's just better learning. But it's really hard because you hire math teachers and you hire English teachers and they do those things because that's what we brought them in there to do. And yet what we really need to do is be able to find ways to push these together. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it was a different testing program, but very similar. It was called NEAP at that time and so forth. And I surveyed all of the third grade teachers across the state, and I had an 80% return rate, which is unheard of in that type of research. And what came across very clearly was the positives of the testing program was that it helped and it pushed people to align curriculum. And then they felt soon after that happened that everything shifted to, you have to have a certain score to be labeled as successful. And then everything started to change, and it was all about the test score. And we've got to get better test scores. We've got to push these kids. We've got to help more kids and so forth. And I think we're still there. And I think the natural tendency is, in order to get good test scores, then if the test is about one topic, then we teach one topic. Because I think the idea of integration and so forth, we can go all the way back to Ted Sizer and his book, Course is Compromise. And that's when I was in my early years of education. I know there were authors before that and thinkers who were, I guess we could go all the way back to Dewey if we wanted to. But we've been talking forever about integration and making things more real. But then the way we measure things really is the tail wagging the dog.
And as you see, we tried to fix that here in New Hampshire, but we're unsuccessful against the beast.
And the other thing I would say is that I'm also a fan of Sizer's trilogy. Those were one of my earliest books, of the Horses, Hope, Compromise, and I forget the other one, but really describing the work we're doing that's actually coming to fruition. Let me put out two hypotheses for you both to react to. One is, I wonder if participation would increase if it is a requirement that you have to commit to some sort of experience or something outside of school. So Ohio right now is doing this, as they have this Ohio SEALs, and every kid has to graduate starting, I think, this year's graduating class. You had to have at least two of these SEALs, right? So it's a forcing factor, making it a requirement. And so that's one question is that a possibility in New Hampshire? Would that work? Or is that something that's workable in the United States? And then the second piece is, it feels like we were taught that there is divisiveness about the pendulum that you're talking about, Steve. However, I am seeing a unifying theory right now around making sure every student is set up well for professional success, for a career, right? And that seems to be not argued between left or right or whatever the case would be. Everybody's behind that. And when you talk to companies and employers, what they're saying is we want students with more real world experiences. We want students who have these competencies that are not just math and English and those kind of things, but the ability to collaborate and communicate and lead and create, all those kind of things. So those feel like two pressures. So one is a policy piece. Could you make it a requirement? And I'm going to start, Frank, for you to react to that because you're in that land. And then the second is just do we have a unifying theory going on right now that more and more employers just want people with more experience?
Yeah, so let me jump in there because the question about whether it's required. So I can tell you in New Hampshire, as an example, we already state in our rules that every student is supposed to be allowed to have one of these extended learning opportunities, right? But it just doesn't happen. It's not the reality.
I'm going to interrupt. Is that allowed or required?
Not required. It's permitted. We basically say that everybody is supposed to have it, but it's not a graduation requirement.
Okay.
So it's not required. It's a voluntary thing. And this is part of the problem when you're trying to answer that question is in education, what we always do is we always stack on top of what is already existing, right? So we're going to sit here and say, okay, it's required for a student to get out, but because that learning happens in this odd environment that we don't know how to determine whether or not they've reached the learning objectives or not, we don't count that, right? And so what we do is we tend to say, we're going to stack all the traditional things that we have, as Steve pointed out, the measurement systems for, and then we're going to put on top these other learning experiences, which, as you alluded to, may be the most valuable learning experiences available. So I think from a policy standpoint, when you go to the required, there will be, and I'm imagining, I don't know if this happened in Ohio or not, I'll ask my colleague over there, but there may be some shrill screams from individuals saying, oh my gosh, who's going to pay for this? Where are we going to get the time? Who's going to, like, all of this additive? Yeah, so if you do it additive, I don't know if you've actually solved the problem, because you're basically going to keep this and then you're going to add it on top, and it's going to give it a short lifespan because eventually it's just the pressures are not there to enhance it. But the obstacle there is, how do I authenticate that learning that happens outside? And so Steve is doing this, and so he can weigh in on this. How do we authenticate this learning that's happening outside? I know ETS is working on a bunch of stuff. The Carnegie Foundation is working on a bunch of stuff. How do we authenticate these really authentic learning experiences given the traditional measurement systems for how we do it? So that would be my first relative to those requirements. But the second piece that you talk about is the industry and our industry partners. And it is like you, and I'm going to guess like Steve, because Steve, I know, talks to a lot of industry partners as well. We hear from the organizations, and those could be post-secondary institutions who are talking to us about how well prepared our students are for a secondary education or a post-secondary education, or the employers directly who are saying to us, hey, the students who are showing up at these opportunities, work-based opportunities, don't have the soft skill capacity to be able to engage well in that environment. And what that should be is, it should be an impetus for us to say, okay, we know these are skills that are going to help these kids be successful. We have got to inculcate our students with them before we let them get away from us. And so I think that the urgency is there. The businesses have been sharing this message consistently with us, and I know across the country. But when we try to attack it, going back to the beginning, on top of what we're already doing, I think we've lost the game.
I appreciate that, is that we are always additive in education. We like to make things bigger and bigger. Even if they're great ideas, it can feel unsurmountable for folks.
Yeah, I'd say the question about, can we require this in schools? It's required of all of our graduates that they're involved in real world experiences. And just to let you know, we have about 10,000 students, and usually by the end of the year, between 8,000 and 1,000 of those students will be full-time with us. It's the full-time students that are required to do it, but it's an option for any kid in the state through us. They have access to all of the same opportunities that our full-time kids do. We also have an advisory program, and we limit the number of advisees to 125, which, if you're going to equate an advisor with a counselor, in traditional schools, they typically have many more kids, and so they have less time. But our instructors spend a lot of time, and the curriculum that they follow with their kids leads all of our seniors to have a future plan when they're ready to graduate from school. And the reason I mention this is because the idea of being ready to move into a career out of high school, I think, is a wonderful thought and something we should work toward. But I don't know if every kid is ready as of 18 years old to do that. However, I think every kid can have a plan for whatever the next steps are. And I think that's where we fall down as an institution is because we don't prepare for that transition. In many cases, we work with you through K through 12 and you graduate and good luck. And I think we can all point to successes, but we can also point to a lot of kids who you speak to 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, you say, you were going to be a plumber, whatever happened. I never got around to doing what I had to do. So I just got a job. Or, yeah, I went to college, but I didn't realize I needed more money and I didn't have it. So we ask all of our kids to plan out that first 12 months. So, yes, they still talk about what they want to do into their infinity, but we also ask them to be very real about what they're going to do next. And so for the kid who says, I want to be a plumber, we're going to say things like, how do you become an apprentice? Where do you go to get the form for that? How much does it cost? We've even gone so far as to do some fundraising, and we have something called the Equal Opportunity Fund, where students can ask for that money. So we have graduates who will say, I need $400 or $500 or more for tools, because I can't afford them otherwise. And we provide them with the funds for that. And we even do that to some degree for undergraduates who are proposing really innovative programs where they might need a few dollars to start a business or something along that line. But I think there have been a lot of programs around the country and in New Hampshire where people have set wonderful goals, like by a certain date in the future, we'll have 60, 70, 80% of our kids either going to college or certified in a certain area. And I think that's laudable, but I'm not sure it takes into account the differences, that all the different things that kids have to do to be successful. And so what I like is this idea of let's plan for the next step. And if your next step is to become a carpenter and become an apprentice right out of high school, let's get you ready for that. If you're going to medical school, let's get you ready for that. But it's how do we help you with that transition that's next? What it forces a lot of kids to do is really think, because there are so many kids who will say, I can remember when I was in the classroom, what are you going to do next year? I'm going to college for what? To go into business. To do what? I don't know, just make lots of money. And that's the depth of their future planning. And it should be, I'll use myself for an example. My first semester, I went to an engineering school. And the reason I went there is I was mechanically inclined, but I had good math and science scores. And so you should be an engineer. I'd never met an engineer in my life. And I think that's the same for a lot of kids. And not only should I have met an engineer, I should have found out that there are 30 different kinds of engineers. I should have seen them at work. I should maybe participated in a few things alongside them. I would have maybe I would have stayed in engineering school, or maybe not. But I think we have to provide all these things for kids. And by doing that, we're going to address some of those soft skills, because what we tend to do in education is, all right, we need to teach soft skills. Let's make a course and let's make the kids sit down and read the book. And now you've got soft skills, and no, you don't.
And maybe that goes back to, so I think you both been helpful to me to answer these two questions, is that I like the idea of this idea of planning, giving students opportunities to create a path for themselves, and also just recognizing that not every 18-year-old is the exact same. We've said this over and over again in this conversation, is that developmentally, there's a wide range about who's ready to do what, but it feels like at least New Hampshire and what you're doing at VLACS, New Hampshire's policies, allow doors to be open where they, through the ELO and Learn Everywhere, that they can go get experiences to test out things. And that's a really powerful thing. So we're near the end. I'm going to give one more question to each of you to answer. And you've both been at this for a while. Start with Frank. And the question is, what's the biggest lesson you've learned in this world of trying to make education better and more accessible for every kid? Frank?
That is a really good question. I would say that the thing that I learned, because I came in from outside of education into this role, and really, so I learned this lesson from Steve and all of his colleagues across the state. In New Hampshire, we are very focused on, as you mentioned, a student-centered approach. I really think that the success of a system is really about making sure that it's about the students and the pathways for the students. In all of our decisions, we just try to have a student-centered approach that focuses on how do I bring this child, this student, to a brighter future. And I think even Steve alluded to that as he's describing his experiences with students. I would say that is my takeaway 8 years into the job as commissioner.
Thank you. Steve, 30 years in plus, what's your big learning?
I would say, I'm trying to phrase this right, that more than any time in my career, I've spoken to parents who tell me how much what we're doing makes a difference. And they're not doing it from the perspective of we're good, others are not good. They're doing it for perspective of this helped my kid. And I had tried other things and it didn't work. We have a face-to-face graduation last year. I'm very proud to say this. We had almost 1,000 people. Commissioner, you remember from when you spoke at our graduation, we were probably at 300 or so at that time. And there are parents who will just come up and said, what you did for not only my kids, but my family is incredible. And they don't mean me. They mean the 250 employees that do the work every day here. They're the true heroes. And personalizing, customizing, whatever we want to call it, makes a difference. And I know wonderful things are happening in regular schools. This is not a criticism. This is just to say that if we're all looking together at how to customize for kids across the board as we go into kind of this new world where we know customization is going to be more and more of an option for people, it's going to help more kids if we do it the right way. And I think to say that the school of the 1950s is where we should be is just not the right approach.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. I think you both summarized the conversation really well. Thank you both for your time. My two couple big takeaways, which are were obvious, I think, from this, is that the reminder that students are learning all the time. And so how can we provide opportunities and reduce barriers to get them to do that and to follow their interests and still give them credit for it, which New Hampshire's done and VLACS is doing. And then just the reminder that not every student learns the same way at the same time. So this jagged profile, and that this expanding what we consider education is inevitable. And it's going to take time. It's a slow process. It's still in its nascency, but the more we can remove barriers and experiment and experience these different ideas, like what's happening in New Hampshire, the more students will feel like they've had an incredible education experience and can reach the goals they want, which is ultimately the goal. Thank you both, Steve, Frank, for your time today and all the work that you're doing for young people in New Hampshire. And I'm sure you're sharing around the country as well. So really appreciate all the work you're doing. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.